In 2022, Counterweight, the organization that Helen Pluckrose founded and that was absorbed into the Institute for Liberal Values, had a virtual conference on liberal approaches to diversity and inclusion. Starting in 2025, we will be rolling out one talk a month that was presented at the conference. We sit down with the original presenters throughout 2025 to see what has changed since 2022. With diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives seemingly on the chopping block, we are curious to hear what our original participants are witnessing and experiencing on the ground. Is DEI really dead or just in remission? Are there healthy alternatives to DEI that we should consider? Or do we throw the baby out with the bathwater and wipe our hands clean? What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments. This month, we share Ellie Avishai's original presentation to the conference. You can find our podcast where we check in with her in the present day to find out how things have changed, entitled The Development of Democratic Citizens, in the show notes. Ellie, it is a pleasure to have you here today, and welcome to the Counterweight Conference on Liberal Approaches to Diversity and Inclusion. For our audience, Ellie is the Director of Strategy and Programs for the Mill Institute for UATX. And for those of you who don't know much about the Mill Institute, they promote viewpoint diversity and nurture a pluralistic society. In addition, Ellie, you are also the founder of the I Think initiative, which teaches how to innovate around complex socioeconomic challenges. And you also hold a doctorate in education leadership from Harvard. And today you are going to be talking to us about the importance of leadership in diversity and inclusion. So with that, thank you for being here, Ellie. Take it away.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Jennifer. And I'm so delighted to be here. I'm delighted to be at this conference. I'm delighted to be in this very esteemed group of speakers. It's really an honor. And I don't want to waste any time. We're just going to dive right in. I'd like to start by looking at 3 stories from 3 different organizations. And you may know these stories, you may not, but I suspect it's not going to take very long to see a common thread. Okay, so here we go. Story number 1. In July of 2020, a petition with 5,000 signatures was circulated, demanding that Trader Joe's rename their brands, such as Trader Jose or Trader Giotto, which sort of played with the name to signal, ethnically inspired products, calling them racist. Trader Joe's declined, and they wrote on their website, "We disagree that any of these labels are racist. We do not make decisions based on petitions. We make decisions based on what customers purchase, as well as the feedback we receive from our customers and crew members." Okay, story 2. In May of 2021, Jason Fried and David Heinmeier Hansen, the co-founders of the software company Basecamp, announced to their staff that employees could no longer talk politics on the shared collaboration platform that the company used. And Fried wrote in what kind of became an infamous memo, "You shouldn't have to wonder if staying out of a political discussion means you're complicit, or wading into it means you're a target. These are difficult enough waters to navigate in life, but significantly more so at work. It's not healthy, and we're done with it." And finally, the most infamous story, I have a feeling you've probably heard of this one. Let me just find my slide. Netflix. So in the fall of 2021, people both inside and external to Netflix called for removal of Dave Chappelle's comedy special, The Closer, calling it transphobic and harm-inducing. And Netflix refused. Co-CEO Ted Sarandis wrote to the staff, "Our goal is to entertain the world, which means programming for a diversity of tastes. The variety and quality of our content is what our members value the most." Okay, so somebody listening to those stories might say, the common thread is that they all resisted wokeness, right? That's what draws all these stories together. Somebody else might see something very different, right? They may see evidence of leaders and, white male leaders to boot, closing their eyes and ears to needed social progress. But I'd like to offer a different perspective, which is that these organizations, each of them, had a clear enough understanding of their values and their strategy. And that this understanding helped them stand firm in the face of public pressure that challenged these values. Okay, and you can kind of get an insight into this by looking at the language that they used. So, Trader Joe's, their strategy focuses on customer and employee experience. So when the petition was circulated, they took a look at what customers were saying. And what they realized is that customers were saying, no, we love these brands. They're hilarious. And also, actually, they make us feel more represented, right? So because they had already established this strategy focused on customer experience, that is the lens through which they pushed back against this petition. Basecamp's leaders have prided themselves on the value of ongoing improvement and testing different systems and rituals for creating an effective work environment. In fact, they've actually written a book on the topic. And so when politics started heating up internally in their staff and they were trying to decide what to do about it, they used the lens of what creates a healthy work environment. And they said, this is not a healthy work environment, so we are going to lean on that and we are going to shut it down. Again, right? Not making a judgment on whether that was the right call or the wrong call, just merely that they had a lens, a clear lens through which to make this decision. And then finally, Netflix. Well, Netflix needs as many customers as they can get, right? They've got a ton of competition, and they have a theory that the way to get a lot of customers is to have a diversity of content, right? And so it was through that lens that they made the decision to keep the special. Now, somebody might say, and maybe they'd be right, that Netflix, well, come on, Dave Chappelle is making Netflix a bundle of money. That's why they kept them, they kept him on their platform. And, maybe there's some truth in there. None of this means that organizations do a perfect job adhering to their values. In fact, case in point, the comedian Andrew Schultz recently pulled his comedy special from a quote unquote unnamed streaming service, whoever that might be, because they were trying to get him to censor his jokes, right? So we're not talking about perfection here. The point is that when your values are clear and actionable, it's far easier to make decisions that honor them. Right? It means that you can behave in a slightly less reactive in a slightly less reactive way during a very reactive time. And that's what this talk is going to focus on, right? How to be slightly less reactive in a very reactive time. Now, to take a step back, I've worked in nonprofits and the education sector for about 20 years. I've held leadership positions for about 15 of those years. But my own interest in what good leadership means really became heightened when it became clear how much of a challenge it's been for leaders to respond to the current pushback against liberal values, right? And in a way, it seems like an oxymoron, right? To imagine that like liberal values could conflict with social justice, right? Values like, individual rights or freedom of expression or tolerance, rationalism, right? These have served as the bedrock to so much of our social progress. But perhaps, because we live in a society where these values are actually so ubiquitous, right? I know for me as a Gen Xer growing up in the 80s and the 90s, liberalism was the water that I swam in. It never occurred to me to figure out how to defend liberalism because it didn't really seem like it needed defending, right? And I think we need to go back and ask how we start that process of defending liberal values, and especially defining how they come into play in our organizational lives. Because when they're not well defined, when they're not well articulated, right, a lot of problems happen. Okay, so let's take a look at what happens when these values aren't well articulated. And I'm willing to bet that many of you have an opinion about that because you've probably experienced it because it's pretty common. So I'm going to sort of tell this story as like a prototypical situation, although I'm, not too proud to admit that many of the mistakes that I'm going to be talking about are all ones that I've made in my own leadership. So here's sort of the story. An organizational leader or leadership team recognizes the need to address issues of diversity and inclusion in their company. Why? Maybe they're getting pressure from their staff. Maybe there's external activism that they've seen going on. Maybe they're just good people and they care about their staff and they care about their organization and they want to kind of be up with the times, right? But whatever the prompt, the leader will make a public announcement to the staff. By public, I just mean formal, like at an all-staff meeting. And they say, you know what, your voices have been heard. We're going to, start this new DEI initiative. And the leader also announces that he or she is new to this work, right? Like we're all going to learn together. This is going to be a journey that we're all going to go on together. So a committee is struck, right, to find the right consultant or DEI hire. And when that consultant or hire is found, the leader makes another show of support, maybe this time publicly, right? And says that the organization is like all behind the effort and that this is one of the most important things we're going to be doing this year. And we're so excited about it. But notice that like this far into the story, the leader hasn't yet named anything particularly specific about why diversity and inclusion efforts are so important in the organization or what precisely the organization is hoping to achieve, right? It's kind of vague or maybe just assumed. So the project commences, right? But shortly into the project, the consultant or, the DEI hire, maybe through workshops or through media they're sharing, starts to deploy ideas that don't actually match the implicit values that the organization has been operating on, right? For example, let's say, a high-performing, sort of fast-paced organization that's attracted very high-performing, fast-paced individuals, face content that says that like hard work and being on time and thinking about individual merit and caring about the written word are all products of white supremacy, right? Simultaneously, right, the consultants imply or straight out say, right, that there isn't a lot of wiggle room on these issues, right? That is, if you disagree, you're likely just not far enough along on your own sort of growth journey to realize how wrong you are, right? So what's the result when the DEI work doesn't really match the implicit values of the organization? Even if these values are pretty implicit and where it's clear that people shouldn't be dissenting. Well, I think we kind of know because many of us are experiencing it, right? The effect of that mismatch is a kind of an organizational stuckness, right? The leadership is now in a bind, right? Where they have publicly endorsed their diversity and inclusion work, and by extension, the ideas and the people who are supporting it. And they've also surrendered their own moral authority by saying how little they know about the topic, right? And I really I feel like I can't say this strongly enough. The minute an organizational leader says that they don't know much about diversity and inclusion, or they're a beginner, or we're all learning together, or any of this language that we hear leaders using, they lose the ability to frame the organizational's thinking about how to approach it. Right? And that doesn't mean that the leader needs to be an expert, right? Humility is good. Learning is good. Being a little, open is all good. But they also don't have to throw away all their priors. And I think that's, something that maybe we've lost a little bit recently. Middle managers are also stuck here, right? Not just the executives, because they become squeezed right? On one side of them are their bosses, right? The executives who at this point are probably hemming and hawing a little bit, right? Because they're starting to see what is coming out of this work and maybe they're starting to pull back the reins a little bit. They're not exactly sure what to do. They're dealing with the bind that they're in. But on the other side of middle managers are their direct reports who are probably pushing for more information, pushing for more action, pushing for quicker action, wondering why they haven't heard anything in a while. And these middle managers are like supposed to be the information sharers, and yet they're probably casting around for information themselves. And the junior staff conversation becomes just rife with speculation, right? There's a lot of water cooler talk, right? The ones that are the most passionate about the work are the voices that get heard the loudest, and everybody else just kind of falls quiet. Well, I mean, if the aim is to create a more open and inclusive environment where people feel like they belong, this is clearly not it, right? Leaders shouldn't be bringing diversity and inclusion work into their organizations until they've developed a clear point of view about two core questions. The first question: what is the problem that a DEI initiative is meant to solve? Right? Kind of simple, but sort of important, right? What is it about the nature of the work in that organization that requires this initiative, right? Because if the problem that the initiative is trying to solve is make sure we have a D&I initiative in our book so that Twitter leaves us alone, right? That's not going to lead to a good end. Right? And the second question is, how will the initiative function within the overall strategy and values of the organization? You know, I recently was at a conference and heard the president of Benedict College. Her name is Rosalind Clark Artis, and actually, I'm going to be playing you a clip of hers at the end of this talk. And she was talking about strategy, and she said, you know, we all know the adage that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And then she added, but that's because strategy doesn't fight back. And I thought that was just brilliant. You know, I couldn't agree more. Organizations have strategies so that they can make decisions. That is the point of a strategy, right? Decisions about what to make, who to make it for, right? But also decisions about what to say no to. Strategy has to be able to fight back. Jason Fried of Basecamp once said in an interview, you know, we can feel wonderful about our contribution to the world without feeling like we have to take on everything that could ever be wrong. You know, people will inevitably have different priorities, but companies must pick a point and navigate towards somewhere, lest they get stuck circling nowhere, right? And that is what I mean by, you know, organizational stuckness. One last thing that I'll say is that I think it's a little too easy to sort of hive diversity and inclusion off to HR, right? Oh, this is a people issue. It's a human resources issue. I can't tell you how many directors of HR are suddenly now responsible for their D&I strategies, right? And I guess in a way, you know, the logic kind of makes sense. It's a people thing. We're looking at who we're hiring and promoting and that kind of thing. But I think it's a really big mistake to consider D&I an HR function. And the reason why is because inevitably, when you start talking about issues of diversity and inclusion internally, it is going to make an impact on how you think about your strategy externally. Because conversations about who your people are become conversations about who your customers are, and how you spend resources on your staff become questions about how you deploy your resources in terms of the work that you're doing. These things all blend together, right? So you can't really stand to the sidelines, right? That's the topic, you know, the title of my talk for that reason. You can't really stand to the side and hive this off to HR or to a consultant and expect that you're going to be able to maintain your strategic direction. Okay, so let's talk about, I've sort of spent a lot of time on the problem. And I want to talk about some not solutions. I mean, if I'd found the solution to this, I think I'd probably be a millionaire. But some thoughts about how to move forward. The first is the importance of being specific. Okay, so one of the biggest challenges that I think organizations face when they engage in diversity and inclusion is that these programs are just too generic. And like if you've ever joked to somebody as you're walking into a workshop that you know exactly what is going to be a part of that workshop, like that you can predict exactly what you're going to hear, then you know what I'm talking about, right? But if the aim is to make things better for a specific group of people in a specific organization, right, you got to get specific, right? It's very important. And so I'll give you an example of what I mean by this. I worked as an executive in a nonprofit organization where staff were very insistent on having a D&I initiative. Mind you, we made all the mistakes that I just named, but that's a different story. And so what we wanted to do was understand a little bit more about why they cared so much, why this was something that they felt we needed. And so we launched a sort of a bunch of listening sessions. And by listening sessions, I just meant we got into small groups and we said to people, just tell us what you think we need to know that we don't understand about what it's like to work here. And then we shut up. And we heard some really interesting things. One thing we learned was that there wasn't really a ton of evidence that there was much racial or gender or sort of that kind of identity discrimination happening in the organization. But there was a ton of evidence that the informal nature of the way that the company ran really overprivileged extroverts. Right? Really overprivileged self-promoters, right? That is, like, if you were the kind of person who spoke a lot in meetings and made a strong case for yourself, you tended to go really far. Whereas if your kind of excellence was a little bit quieter, those people tended to get overlooked a lot. Well, that is a big problem. And that is a problem about diversity and inclusion. But it's not the kind of problem that you're necessarily going to hear if somebody is coming into your organization and doesn't understand it deeply. We also discovered that, the staff were often saying that they wanted to be sort of more involved in decision making. But after we listened to the challenges they were facing, we realized that they didn't mean that they actually wanted to make the decisions, like that they understood that different functions make different decisions. But what they wanted was to know why decisions had been made. Like, why was a particular person promoted, or why was a particular project taken on? They were just feeling in the dark. And again, we sort of reflected on that and realized, well, this is really a problem with the informal nature of this organization. And these were problems that we could solve, right? And it also helped us define words like diversity, inclusion, belonging, fairness, right? These words need to be defined. They could mean a million things. When you say diversity, do you mean racial diversity? Do you mean gender diversity? Do you mean diversity of thought? Right? If you haven't defined these terms for yourself, then how can you know when you've reached them? So, idea number 2, get up to speed. Okay, so what I mean by that is that when leaders reveal themselves to be either kind of ignorant of or maybe just a little disinterested in words like tokenism or allyship or privilege or microaggressions, the most passionate members of their team, the most passionate about diversity and inclusion, will write them off, right? Maybe not to their face. Maybe behind their back, but they're going to write them off, right? As out of touch. And worse, someone who's maintaining a position of power without doing the necessary work of leadership. And in a way, they have a point, right? It does require some effort, but in order to lead a process of diversity and inclusion, you really need to introduce yourself, expose yourself to different perspectives on that. And I suspect many of you, if you're at this conference, already know that and are already doing that. It's just very important to have a familiarity with, for example, the way definitions are shifting, right? The word racism today, a squirrel just went right by my window. The word racism today does not mean the same thing that it meant 10 years ago in common parlance. If you don't know that, it's going to be pretty difficult for you to engage in a deep way with somebody for whom that is their sort of driving, their driving value. You need to understand the logic and the heart, right? The emotional heart of arguments that come from places, for example, like critical theory. That doesn't mean you need to agree with it. You don't, but you need to understand it, right? And getting up to speed also means being aware of the follies that exist in the current D&I consulting industry, right? It's a very new industry that has just sprung up like lightning fast. There are thousands of consultants now doing this work, many of whom haven't been doing it for that long. And there, are questions that it makes sense to ask, right? One question is, what is their content? Right? And it's a good idea to see the content of potential consultants that you're vetting, right? Is what they're teaching, does that match the problem that you're trying to solve, right? The problem that you've articulated, right? And when you share that set of challenges with a consultant, are they interested in it? And are they interested in sort of customizing to that? Or are they busy telling you why that's not the real issue, right? Big difference. It's also a great idea to ask consultants how they respond to criticism. I think one of the most important questions you can ask when you're vetting a D&I consultant is, what do you do when somebody steps up in the middle of a session and disagrees with you? Because if they say, as most of the consultants that I've vetted in my time say, well, I would kind of take them aside and tell them where they're wrong. I'd be patient with them, but I'd make sure they understood that they're wrong. I don't think that's the consultant to hire. So just some food for thought about that. Finally, I have to find my mouse here. DEI initiatives often spring up in a kind of a haphazard way. You often see a lot of committees being formed, but their committees are formed like, who wants to be part of this? And they're sort of self-formed. I think that's a bad idea. I've never seen those committees do great work. And the reason is because their scope is too vague and it's also too big. Right? Now, Frank Dobbin and Alexandra Kalev wrote an article in HBR in 2016. Some of you may have probably have read this. It's called Why Diversity Problems Fail and What Works Better. And they name some processes that I think are worth, they bear mentioning again. One is that creating committees, great, but make them cross-functional teams. That is, make sure you have like people from different parts of the organization. Make sure you have leaders as part of that committee, right? So that they have some heft, and give them clear mandates and clear deadlines. That is, we want you, Committee X, we want you to look at how we might be able to diversify our hiring pipeline. You have this much time. We want you to make a recommendation to the organization. And if we love it and sign off, maybe you'll lead the charge, right? That's what I mean by sort of clear mandate, clear deadline, clear measure of success. Dobbin and Kalev also suggest having a mentorship program that's formalized, because informal mentoring programs have a tendency to be a little more homogeneous, and you might fall into some of the problems that I described we fell into earlier. That is, some people get overlooked because they don't self-promote enough, right? So having a formal mentorship program really eases that a bit and creates more diversity amongst, the mentors and the mentees. And then finally, they just talk about contact. Right? Are there people in your organization who don't talk a lot to other people in the organization because of function, because of another reason? And the more that you can actually facilitate the integration of different people on your team so that they just get to know each other more, even just that is going to be more effective, right, than, for example, a series of workshops that feel disconnected from your organizational strategy. Finally, I hope this is sort of the most important thing that you take from this talk, that this is a human problem with a lot of human issues. And from a leadership perspective, this is terrifying stuff. It's not easy for anyone, right? Even organizational leaders, to withstand intense pressure and make unpopular decisions. So what I want to highlight is that really the only way to withstand the kind of pressure that leaders are in is to know what you believe in, right? To be so clear about what you believe that you care more about that than you care about being liked, or maybe even your job, right? Which may seem crazy, and not everybody can do that. But I really do believe it's that important, right? If you know what your core values are, and you can articulate to yourself how they are being validated or violated in any situation, you can kind of overcome that vague feeling of dread that arises when you're out of sync with your integrity, right? So yes, this is an organizational issue, but it's also a very personal one. So I'm going to wrap up by playing a clip. I told you that I was going to share something that Rosalind Clark Artis had said, and I am again just going to find my mouse. Here we go. Rosalind Clark Artis was speaking about leadership. She was actually asked to talk about sort of her leadership philosophy as an administrator for a higher educational institution. And what I want you to listen for is just how well she embodies this idea of knowing your values and just standing in them, and how her clarity about what she believes about education has allowed her to take some pretty big risks in her career. So here's Rosalind Clark Artis. It's about a minute and a half.
I sit here today as one who has had the opportunity to stand in a difficult decision. I think our primary responsibility as leaders of higher education institutions are to, one, create conditions conducive to free inquiry on our campuses. We are the leaders, we are the compass, if you will. We set the tone for the culture on the campus in many respects. And in order to do that, we have to, one, model the behavior that we desire. We have to be willing to make difficult decisions. We have to be willing to stand in the fire, so to speak. I lead a historically black college. Imagine for a moment my welcoming Donald Trump to the campus of a historically black college. It did not make me particularly popular, I can tell you. I wish I were canceled. Canceled is painless. I was drugged repeatedly by multiple national and local outlets. I got death threats. I got dead animals in the mail. It was a blast. But by standing in that and creating a teachable moment for my faculty, my staff, and my students, you will survive. We did the right thing. Our students did not catch a deadly disease because they listened to a perspective that was inconsistent perhaps with their own. The legacy and history of our institution was used as an excuse to prohibit the expression of ideas that are inconsistent with our founding principles. That suggests that our students don't have the ability to parse through other ideas. It suggests that our students lack the capacity to distinguish between views, to ask questions, to challenge, to inquire. I am insulted and offended by that notion, and you should be too.
I mean, Rosalind Clark Artist doesn't really need any explanation. She's so wonderful. I just wanted to say thank you for your attention. Thank you for attending this conference and for challenging orthodoxies. Jennifer, you mentioned in your introduction that I'm part of the founding team for the Mill Institute at UATX, which is the wonderful new university that's actually being built currently as we speak in Austin. The Mill Institute is going to be serving as an innovation hub within the UATX community. Our role will be to research and teach the mindsets and ground rules and intellectual skills needed to engage with difficult and contentious topics. We're also going to be disseminating best practices to other institutions of higher learning. So if that's exciting to you and you want to know more about it, please come find me. I'm going to be around during this conference. I'm making sure, that the organizers have my contact information, and please do reach out and let me know. I would love to share more with you. And with that, back to you, Jennifer.
And Ellie, this gave me so much to think about. There's a couple of things that really hit home for me that I'm just going to kind of repeat to make sure that I got it. But the biggest thing, of course, is this: be specific and know your own values before applying those values to any program that you adopt, D&I or otherwise,
Yeah.
And I really love the idea when you were talking about what you could do. You talk about a mentorship program, which I think is awesome. You talk about contact. This is what I really like. I don't feel like we go into these programs, DEI programs, and we put each other in affinity groups.
Yeah.
And that lessens the contact that really allows diversity to flourish.
Yeah.
It creates more division. And so that idea of mentorship with mentorship and contact combined, where people are actually getting to know the real person and not seeing them as an avatar or a caricature for their race or their gender or whatnot. And that's just, to me, so beautiful in its simplicity of a strategy for businesses to do. I have one question for you here. Well, actually, I've got two questions. You talk about values, and I love that. And I really do feel like when a company, and you mentioned three, that when a company knows their values, they're able to create a strategy around their values. What do you think happens, though? And you mentioned already a lot of the people who are invested in DEI work are employees, and they usually have the biggest platform. What happens when their personal values clash with a company's values? I mean, that's the big question, right? So you can say, this is our company's values, but these people who might be pushing something are like, well, but that's not my value. I mean, what, as a leader, how do you untangle that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I think that that's happening, right? Everywhere. I mean, I think this isn't just a hypothetical, right? This is reality. And I mean, part of it, I think, comes down to sequencing, right? So, if you're kind of like chugging along organizationally without having really defined very clear values, and then you engage in DEI work, and that makes you realize, oh man, like this kind of conflicts with our values. So now we have to have a whole new initiative that's like, what are our values, right? This actually happened to me in an organization that I was in, and simultaneously this DEI initiative. And then those two things might not actually be the same initiative. So then things really go haywire. I mean, I think the only way that companies can help at least ease that problem is to make their values clear, like from the beginning when they hire, right? So like, for example, Basecamp, I know I brought them up a couple times, but after sort of the debacle with, this memo that said no employees should be talking politics, about a third of their company quit, right? example of people's values not matching, not matching the values of the company. They gave them very generous severance, but they quit. But ever since they've been hiring, if you look at a Basecamp job description, it says like right on the job description, we are an organization that doesn't talk politics. This is why. This is what we believe in. If these are your values, come work for us. If they're not your values, then maybe there's another place for you. And that's hard. Like I think it's a difficult thing to do because companies, I think more and more are being seen as like homes, like we spend so much time working.
Mm-hmm.
They're sort of our homes. And so it's like, we're a home. Like we want to be all inclusive. We don't want to tell certain people like, don't work here, and obviously companies sometimes often have a lot of learning to do too. Like sometimes they're doing stuff that isn't very helpful and they should be changing, but they're not. They're companies, and in the same way that some people want to be working in a place where they're, working, 12-hour days and chugging and maybe be part of a startup where everything's kind of chaotic, and other people just want like to do the same job every day and be able to predict like as soon as at 4:00 that they're done. Mm-hmm. Different kinds of people are going to be drawn to different organizations, and if they can make that clear, I think it makes, it eases that. But it is messy when they haven't been defined. Yeah.
You just said something that I think is really interesting, and I think you just hit on something that I haven't really thought about throughout this conference. But one of the ideas behind belonging in D&I work is that you can bring your full self to work. Right. But what you said is also very true. I mean, that's a nice idea. I personally don't want to bring my full self to work. There's some things I want to leave at home. But I think maybe that's where some of this confusion gets in there is companies cannot accommodate, everyone in their full selves. I mean, they are a company and then they've got to accommodate whatever it is the company values are. And so that's really interesting. And that's a mindset that I think takes me to what my last question I was going to say. You mentioned earlier that when you growing up, you kind of swam in liberal values and you didn't even think that you'd ever have to defend it.
Yeah.
What got us to a place, if you can even pinpoint it, and maybe not, to where this idea that disrupted liberal values, but also I think it ties into what I was just saying. I think we've come to define work differently. We've come to define work as something that should be, part of our whole selves. Is there any way, again, I asked to untangle or to address that issue that makes everyone happy? I don't know that there is. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Whew.
I know that's
Don't
big,
ask me
right?
a hard question, Jennifer.
I don't know that there is an answer.
I'll tell you, I mean, there's something that you said that I kind of want to like pull the string of, and I'll do it and hope that by doing it, somehow I'll answer your question. You talked about people bringing their full selves to work. And I think that like somewhere along the line, and I would love to hear from researchers who know sort of precisely when that was, but somewhere along the line, I think we started having a fundamental confusion about how we are defining bring your whole self to work, or even just like what the goal is when we talk about a good work environment. So, researchers like Amy Edmondson at Harvard, have been doing work for years on something called psychological safety.
Yeah.
That phrase, just the whole idea of psychological safety has been completely misunderstood and turned on its head, right? Psychological safety means, like the definition of that term is that there is an ability for people to take intellectual risks and emotional risks, right? And know that, the room will hold them. Know that they're not going to get into trouble. Know that they are in a place where they can spitball, where they can make a mistake, where they can really just like fall into a huge blunder. And none of that is really going to be a big deal. That is what psychological safety means.
Right.
Psychological safety doesn't mean that you never encounter ideas that you find challenging, right? This sort of goes back to what Rosalind Clark Artis was saying. It doesn't. And we're sort of, I think people are now interpreting this idea of bringing yourself to work as in like all desires that I have, all ways that I sort of imagine who I am in the world. These things are like not only relevant to my workplace, but if they're not seen or not recognized explicitly, it means that they're denied. I mean, no organization can function like that, right? But I do think we can move to a place that teaches more about what psychological safety is and what teams need to do in order to achieve it, right? Because without psychological safety, you do not have innovation. Without psychological safety, you don't have laughter, right? Without psychological safety, you don't have joy in a workplace, right? You often don't have effectiveness. And what we're seeing now, as people are like trying to bring their full selves in, and yet we're completely lacking psychological safety. It should be flipped, right? What we should be focusing on is how people can take intellectual risks and not be targeted as a result. If we have that, people will naturally feel more included and safe because they'll know that they're actually in a safe environment. So I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. And I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because I'm actually reading Amy Edmonton right now on psychological safety.
Oh, yeah.
And I just want to point out, yes, her idea of psychological safety is so different than the way D&I expresses psychological safety. It's about feeling safe to take risks, not, and wow. Yeah. I think that is, we probably ought to put, a link to that in this talk, because that is the way psychological safety has been manipulated by the D&I industry has been completely a facelift from what the original meaning of it was. And it is incredibly important for all workplaces when done right.
Yeah, I mean, and look, people talk a lot now about brave spaces instead of safe spaces. I do actually think that's what they mean, right? So I do think there is some sort of understanding of the importance of that. It's just that if, it's not easy to come by. Like psychological safety is hard because people don't like taking risks, right? It doesn't feel particularly comfortable, like recording a talk in front of a bunch of people, like not a completely comfortable thing to do, like these things you gotta, you sort of have to summon yourself a bit. That if you're not focusing on that, if you're not like teaching people how to do that constantly and constantly reinforcing as one of your organizational values, perhaps the importance of being able to share any kind of idea and know that you're going to be, it might not be, the idea might not be taken, right? You might not win the conversation, but that you'll be fine, right? I mean, that I think is so important. So yeah, I think we just need more emphasis.
Yeah, it's so important, and I think missing too, or at least in its pure form, as originally intended.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. This has been so helpful in really bringing in this idea of leadership, which I think has been missing in a lot of the conversations around D&I, and how leadership needs to take a very top level role in creating values before we really even have that discussion on what next with D&I. So Ellie, a lot of great insights here. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's been absolutely my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.